Okay, what I want to do is I'm going to show you basically a slideshow. And the purpose is sort of twofold. One is to give you some visuals to go with the idea of just sort of some of the physical aspects of the world that is China, and to a certain extent the area around. And then also to give you some sense of, as I mentioned last time, is why when you're in this part of the world, especially in China, they do see themselves as having their own unique history, social relationships, etc., that aren't really part of the world outside of East Asia, which I think is for especially Americans, but Europeans also is a little hard for them to fathom. Though if you think about the whole Marco Polo thing of the East in the sense of Asia, or what you used to call the Orient, which is this area, has always had an enormous amount of fascination, almost mystical qualities to it, which in a bizarre way when you look at tourism is still still sort of there. So let's take a look at some of these images. We do our work around this year Shanxi province. We work with the provincial authorities, the Shanxi Provincial Archaeological Historical Preservation Authorities, which is one of their ministries. We also work with a guy that used to be with them, who's now the head of historical buildings and sort of artifacts. And Xi'an itself, the city, is a very modern city. On the excuse me, on the other hand, not unusual in China. The city itself actually has a tremendously long history. Xi'an, in one way, shape, or form, was actually used to be called Chang'an. It was the center of China and the center of roughly, I think, 11 different dynasties in terms of rulers. So this was the imperial capital for most of Chinese history, way back from the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, up through the basically the Eastern Wei, I think, dynasty. And so what you get is this place has an enormous amount of history and an enormous amount of archaeology, since it was a capital since roughly 2,200 years ago. So in fact, if you look at the city, you can see this rectangle here. This is actually the old imperial capital, or I should say, this is a considered a recent capital because this is the Ming Dynasty. And so what you get is these overlays of enormous amounts of history and enormous amounts of time that sort of define China and define cities. And this has a huge impact on the way people see themselves and their other folks. People in Xi'an, for example, if they're born and raised in the city, have a very strong sense that they are the original, sort of sophisticated center of culture and style, et cetera, for all of China. If you go to Japan, you'll see very much the same attitude in Kyoto, which was the imperial capital for about 1,500 years. So, to guys in Xi'an, even today, the folks there, if you talk to the locals, like the guys we work with, they really do see Beijing and Nanjing and these other places as a bunch of sort of like nouveau types. Even though they might have been a capital for 300 or 400 years, they're just fresh off the boat as far as they would see them. And very much the same thing in Japan. Almost anywhere in Japan, you'll find that people's attitude towards Tokyo, which used to be called Edo, is that was some little fishing village till about 400 years ago when the shogun set up shop there. But it's not. The people there are sort of bourgeois and really aren't hugely sophisticated, unlike the folks in, say, Kyoto. So there's a tremendous amount of this sort of sense of place tying to history, and history not in like 50 years or 100 years or a couple of hundred years, but history that goes back thousands of years. So it's important to remember that when you're looking at someplace like this, their history goes way, way, way back. This is the eastern terminus of the Silk Road. If you were Marco Polo or something like that, or if you're Rome and you want Chinese silks or whatever it is from China, that originally came from Xi'an, and it goes all the way from here, all the way basically to the Eastern Mediterranean, which I didn't get to yet. There we go. To the Eastern Mediterranean, at which point it then gets traded to Rome. So if you visualize that starts all the way over here and goes all the way over here, roughly, I think, 2,200 miles or something like that. Now, the Chinese were basically interested in information. As far as they were concerned, technologically, there was nothing in the West they were particularly interested in until basically sort of the late medieval period. So the West was always interested in what China had, but China wasn't really interested in what the West had. And this perception persisted right down until the sort of early mid 20th century. for China, especially, and to sort of East Asia in general. So let's take a look at some of the images that sort of might give you a better sense of place here. Okay, on the right-hand side, this is an image when you're flying at 30,000 feet or whatever it is from Beijing going west. This is the type of mountain systems that you have that separate China from Siberia and China from Mongolia. And the key here, as I sort of, I think, mentioned in passing last time, is that if you notice you don't have a mountain, which you actually have, you really can't see it too well here, but there's actually about 400 miles, as far as I can tell, of mountains that separate this. So if you go over one mountain, you've got another mountain. You go over that mountain, you got another mountain. So you can see getting through this, an individual can get through, but, trade, commerce, roads, railways, ain't happening. That's just too incredibly expensive. So these physical barriers that basically act as a fence between China and the rest of the Eurasian continent. This is very typical of them. The Himalayas are probably the most spectacular, but this one's actually in some ways the most striking when you realize you're at 30,000 feet as far as you can see all the way to the horizon. It's nothing but one mountain after another. It's sort of a stunning statement of sort of physical geography. To the left here, what we have is this the Longhe. This is at the Ordos Curve region. So this is in the northern part of China. So I'm just, if I was being taken from where I'm thinking from, this would be China, and this in many cases would actually be Mongolia on this side of it. And this is key for two things. One is, I think I mentioned in the passing last time, notice how brown the river is. It basically has the largest amount of silt per gallon of water of any river in the world, as far as I know. Also, what's not really as obvious here, but if you look at it, if you notice the color here of this area here is exactly the same as the river. And that's because all this is what we call loess. Loess is basically soil that's been picked up as dust. And since the winds blow from the west to the east across Eurasia, if someone's plowing a field in France or Germany or something like that, and they're not paying attention and the winds pick up and the dust goes into the air, the very, very fine grains of dust, not like the dirt that ends up on a car, but I mean, the really fine stuff, basically talcum powder size, will end up in the middle high atmosphere, and that basically travels east. When it hits these border regions, these mountain systems in separate China from the west and the north and the south, what happens is that wind basically slows down and those pieces drop. And so over millions and millions of years, what you have is, if you look at this dirt here, and this is all basically almost like talcum powder. It's amazing stuff, and it makes life really hard if you think about it. It's very hard to build a house on a pile of talcum powder. So this is sort of solidified, but it's still very, very loose, and it's very, very fine grained. And if you notice, there's not really much in the way of rocks here. In fact, this is actually just sort of clumps of this. So in this situation, when the river comes through, it cuts through this very, very fine material. And that's why there's so much of it in the river. But the other part of this loess is that it's very rich in nutrients. So if you're a farmer, I mean, this area here is desert, but if you notice, for a desert, it's got a lot of green. And if you're a farmer and you're somewhere near this river or any other river, you can basically plant almost anything you want here, because the loess is incredibly rich soil. And so what you find is that whole, plain of China that I mentioned last time when we were looking at the general map, is basically made up of loess. And so China basically is the beneficiary of all the dirt from the Eurasian continent to the west, ends up in China. And this is one reason why they have such fantastic agricultural potential, is simply the fact that they've got this tremendous amount of this windborne dirt. Now, the other place you see this, ironically, is the Midwest and Southern Canada and in North America, where it's exactly the same phenomenon. The winds come across, they dump the dirt there, and that's what's oftentimes called your black or brown soils that you see in places like Kansas and then, say, Alberta and such like that. It's exactly the same thing as what you see here in China. So these two particular regions, by virtue of, again, the physical aspects of the landscape, were given tremendous potential. Now, of course, the downside of this is if the river floods, it's going to go anywhere it wants to, because there's no rocks here. This is just basically piles of sand, for all intents and purposes. So if the river wants to go this way and it cuts its way through, off it goes. So this again is sort of the danger and the benefits of this type of a system, is this idea of what we call loess, which is this idea of this particular soil pattern. Now, if we look at some of the impacts of this, to the right here, we have a part of the Great Wall. This is Ming Dynasty, so this actually isn't the original series of walls. There's about 6,000 miles of walls total in China. Almost every dynasty way back to about 3 or 4,000 years ago would put up walls to demarcate territory, but the walls don't really serve the same function as they do, I think, in the Western context. And then sort of, the Great Wall really isn't a fortification. What you see here in the right-hand image is the wall that was built in the Ming Dynasty. So this particular wall is about 600, 700 years old. So it's pretty recent, actually. If you notice, the wall goes up here, it goes over, you see it wandering over here, and it goes down on this ridge here. And it goes, the Ming wall goes for, I think it's 2,400 miles, I forget. You can go check somewhere. They're constantly sort of revamping this. The guys we work with have remapped the sections in Shanxi province in the north. So if you look at this particular structure, the key thing about this is you have to remember in this particular case, let's see, we're trying to remember how this was oriented. Yeah, okay, this direction is actually north. Sorry, this particular image is taken from looking west, I guess. So here's the wall. And what you've got is this area over here would, in the Ming Dynasty, not be considered China. If you cross the wall, and this is a gatehouse here so that people can get through into China, this side is considered China. So the key thing about this is actually a marker. And if you think about it from the standpoint, if you got a bunch of aggro guys like Mongols or something like that roaring around, and they've got lassos, they've got ropes, and they've got ladders and stuff like that, they can get across this wall any place they want to. As long as you're vaguely athletic, you could hop across the wall up here. In fact, in some cases, if you notice, the rocks are actually higher than the wall. So the wall's really lousy protection. It's not a fort wall. It's a marker. And in Asia, this is true in all of Asia. Koreans probably most embrace this today of all three regions. But in Asia, there's a very strong sense that cities and walls demarcate civilization. So the attitude the Chinese would have is that if you're on this side, you're in the savage world where there's no rules, everything goes, it's sort of like their version of the Wild West. If you cross through the gatehouse and you're on this side, you're now in China. Now there's rules, now there's orders, now there's someone in charge, and everything's predictable. So this is the unpredictable world of everything else. This is the predictable world of China. And that's the function of the wall. The function of the wall on walls in general, whether they be city walls or the Great Wall or whatever, were demarcate what the Chinese would call civilization, which to them just meant, Chinese rule. And everything outside of it was just anarchy. And, you can probably most dramatically see this if I can find an image here. Let me stop this. Let's see if I can find an image. This is Jiayu Yuguan. This is the western end of China. So, if you were the great sage, traveling west during the story of Monkey, for example, Journey to the West. If you were traders, you can see some camels here. If you were traders going to Rome, if you're traders going anywhere else, this was your last piece of China. And it's very evocative because again, on one hand, it's this huge fort. On the other hand, it's not really so much a fort. It's actually a statement, again, just like the Great Wall. Here you can see the Tian Shan Mountains to the north. Basically, you're leaving China. You're leaving civilization. You're going into the great world of whatever. And of course, if you're coming back from the rest of the world, now you're going to be in China. Now you're going to be in civilization. Now you're going to be where there's predictability and laws and control. And this is the image in Asia of cities and of these type of structures, is that walls define predictability, walls define control. And in Asia, it's very important to remember that people view where they live in terms of predictability. In Asia, you're willing to give up a tremendous amount of what, especially in the United States, would be individual freedoms, individual rights, the right to do whatever you want to, et cetera, et cetera. In Asia, what people really want is predictability. Because you have to remember, in Asia, as in most of the world, there is no rule of law. There never has been, and there still isn't in most of Asia, certainly not in China. And I would argue certainly not in Korea or Japan. What you have is laws or guides, but laws don't define appropriate behavior. The group defines appropriate behavior, and basically the legal system is there to enforce group attitudes, which actually laws do anywhere. But in Asia, it's very explicit because you do not have, even today, for example, in China, if you get arrested for something, you want to see a lawyer, they'll fall on the floor laughing. Because the only reason lawyers are there is to argue what your sentence should be. So you don't have the idea that, well, I've got rights. And in fact, in much of the world, the minute you know an American is if they say something like that, and everyone just looks, I'm like, oh, okay, we know where that person's from. Because in the rest of the world, you don't have rights. What you have is the rights that the group gives you. You piss people off, and they're going to remove those rights, and now you're just shafted. So in that system, that's what the walls mean. The walls mean that when you come inside of this fort, when you come inside the Great Wall, when you come into China, you're moving into an area where the group rules, the group's in charge, and that gives you comfort to the sense that you know what's going to happen, you know how people are going to operate, you know how the system works. Outside of that, you just don't know. And you don't know, there's no predictability in it. Just because you can get something done today outside of the walls doesn't mean it's going to happen tomorrow. So in Asia, what people want is predictability and stability. Americans love to talk about the idea of uniqueness and doing something different every day, but the reality is I suspect we're actually pretty much the same. In Asia, they're just more straight up forward about it. Okay, so you see two other images. To the right, what you see is a cute little house in the town of Sunyi, which is about 120 clicks northeast of Xi'an. The guys you worked with took us up there to sort of check the place out. What's really striking about this place is that, if you're into environmental studies, what's really fascinating, here's your loess. So here's that, wind-borne dirt that ends up, basically covering this entire area to about 1,500 feet deep. So all these hills here are actually loess. So if you notice, it's incredibly easy to dig through this stuff. If you had a shovel, you could end up clearing the area for this house in probably 2 or 3 days. And your main hassle would just be moving the dirt around. From an environmental standpoint, it's really fascinating is if you go and you put this stuff and you pack it very tightly into bricks, that's actually what this house is made of. So this house is made out of loess. So on one hand, you dig through this area, you then use the dirt to make the bricks to make the house. If you fire the bricks, so you fire them up to a higher temperature, then you've got the tiles here. So with the exception of the wood, that's in the framing here, all the rest of this house is made literally from the dirt around it. It's incredibly environmentally efficient. It's no going down to Lowe's and picking up something that came by boat 3,000 miles. The other thing that's really striking about this area, you can sort of see it here in the background, it's just sort of lumped with sort of what's basically one of the older style cave dwellings. This particular village has been here for at least 7,000 years. Now, this particular house is probably from the 1950s, 1960s, I'd say 60s, but it can't be newer because it's got the really old style roof that you only find in this particular area. You go 100 miles away, you don't see roofs built this way. This is unique to the area around Sunyi. But the key here is if you go and you look in this back where this little edge here is in the back of these guys' property, or literally right from where this dirt is still here, you dig down and you're going to be digging through 6,000 years of people living in the same spot. And according to what my colleagues were telling me is a lot of the families that live here have been in the same place. Now the house isn't the same, but they've been in the same place for maybe 3,000 or 4,000 years. So what you get is enormous continuity in terms of the sense of place. Visualize, Americans get really hyperactive about having been in the same place for, 100 years. If you're Hawaiian and you identify with, being Hawaiian here, that's basically settlement in Hawaii is estimated to be roughly about maybe 1300 AD. So you've been here for maybe 1,000 years. These folks had been there for 2,000 or 3,000 years before Polynesians even arrived in Hawaii. And these folks in this little village in the middle of nowhere have been there in that village in one way, shape, or form for that entire time. And people in one way, shape, or form have been there for 6 or 7. Might be the same people, we don't know. You just don't have historical records going back there. But we have, according to these guys, we have the tax records for the town of Sunyi going back at least to the Qin dynasty, which is 221 BC. And they actually have some of the same family names you still see in the town here now. So, when you talk about historical continuity in place, this is hugely greater than what you see, for example, in Italy. You go to someplace like Rome, you're not going to find neighborhoods where the folks are the same people who lived there when it was Imperial Rome in 200 AD or something like that. Continuity here is sort of mind-blowing, and it's not unique. Very typical if you're in southern Japan, to certain some parts of Korea, but especially in China. Enormous longevity of place in terms of people in place. And there's an enormously intimate, close relationship of people in place, which you don't tend to see. Otherwise, you just look and you see a little village that has sort of interesting, very eco-friendly architecture. But in reality, it's a much more complicated phenomenon. Now, on the left here, what we see is what happens when you end up on the inside of the walls. You end up in the inside of the walls, that puts you in rule, that puts you in control, and that puts you in, until recently, Imperial China. In fact, as we can see, you could argue that Xi Jinping is trying to bring back Imperial China. This is the tomb of the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, which has been actually the subject of a fair number of movies. I think one of the Mummies one was dealing with that. But this is an actual tomb. So this is the landscape. When the first emperor was getting ill, they literally built a hill that was 700 feet tall and covered about basically everything. If you're going to put it in our context, so that's about half again higher than Diamond Head, and would cover everything from Diamond Head to downtown and all the way back to here in Palolo. And it's just this one mound for one ruler who was buried in the middle of it. It's actually half of it's now eroded out because it was largely made of lists. So it's, not surprisingly the rains hit and stuff washed out. But this is how much is still left. And it's still sort of striking to realize this is literally done by people with wicker baskets. Literally thousands and thousands of people working, 6-7 days a week, probably from sun up till sundown, moving dirt just to make this mound so that one guy can be buried in the middle of it. And for the next 700-800 years, you find that Chinese emperors were frequently buried in these mounds, and some are actually more spectacular than the first emperors. But his is famous for like a gazillion different reasons. But this gives you some idea of the power of the centralized state authority. So even though these guys were to the north, their ancestors would have been around when this was built, and it's very possible some of their ancestors had their butts dragged down to Xi'an or was in Chang'an for the purpose of building, helping to build this mound. Who knows? But it gives you some idea of the continuity of time. This mound is over 2,200 years old and served the function for the burial spot for one person. And that gives you, again, some idea of the idea of continuity, but also this idea of just the importance of the power of a centralized state, which is a huge part of this. And again, people put up with this because it gave them predictability. This is the last image. This is the city wall for Xi'an. Xi'an's one of the few cities in China that still has its city wall. In fact, it's the largest, I think. There's a few smaller cities that have, more intact walls. Again, the wall dates from the Ming Dynasty. So the bricks you see right here are from basically 1450 to 1500. So that makes them 500 years old? Yeah, something like that, about 500 years old. And this is still pretty much intact. The guys we work with, actually the guy that I work with, one of his jobs is to make sure this thing stays intact. Those of you that are interested in doing a really exotic marathon, if and when China opens back up, you can they run a marathon. The city walls go for 26.7 miles. So they actually run a marathon. I think he said it was in late March, early April, on top of the city wall, which is about 40 feet wide. So, they must limit the number of people up there or something. But it's sort of cool. You can take a bicycle. We took a bicycle, take bicycles around the wall. So the wall's still intact. And again, the key here is this is the North Gate. And the key here again is this idea of control. Even though you're inside the Great Wall, so you're inside China, the idea of a place to live and city were actually sort of synonymous. So if you really wanted to be comfortable in China, you lived within the walls. So again, these walls on one hand are fortification walls, but they're also equally important as symbolic walls. Outside, the government was less concerned about, keeping control. You're not going to find the Chinese version of police traditionally wandering around outside. You do now, but not back in the day when this was built. Inside the city, there were enormous numbers of rules. In Xi'an, as in all China cities, there were curfews. So, for example, where you could live was specified by the government. What you could do was specified by the government to a certain extent. There were curfews. You could only have, for example, bars in certain parts of town. And the bars all had to close. I think it was roughly, 2 hours after sunset. And there's a huge bell tower in Xi'an where basically they would ring the bell on the hour, but they'd also have special bell tones. They would use to tell everyone, okay, now it's time to go home. And a half an hour after curfew, they would have military patrols or police patrols going out. And if you were found wandering the streets after curfew, you'd be arrested. And they've had this for at least 2,000 years. We have Han Dynasty, rules from like 5 AD on, what do you do with folks caught after curfew? So, outside of the walls, there weren't curfews. Outside of the walls where most people lived, especially your rural population, agricultural possible, folks in Sunyi, for example, there weren't curfews. Inside the walls, there were more rules. But, you put it in a context when this was Chang'an, and this is actually a much smaller town that was in the Ming Dynasty than it was when it was the capital. Chang'an was by far the largest city in the world. It's about 4 times the size of Rome. In fact, there are estimates it might have been about 700 AD. It might have been the size of all European towns combined, just in one city in China. So it's an entirely different system. And if you sort of visualize things that way, you can see why people in the past, or even people today who have this as their heritage, aren't really too impressed when people talk about Imperial Rome or London or the British Empire or, American, stuff they did in World War II. They're sort of like, dude, that's like last week. They don't see that as being a really compelling argument. And I think this is one of the things that Americans have a really hard time grasping. This would include the American government, is we don't really understand history. Europeans understand history a little better. But again, they think that the history revolves around Europe. And if you notice, this whole course has started with Europe. And if you take a history class, about 80 to 90% of world history is actually European related history. There's very, very few world history courses taught in Western universities, whether it be US or in Europe. They really spend a lot of time on Asia. It's usually one chapter, which of course, if you're Chinese or Japanese or Korean, tends to really piss the hell out of you because that's really bogus. History is equally complex and equally powerful as it is in the West. It's just that in the last couple of centuries, the West has dominated things, and most importantly, the intellectual tradition we're a part of sees the West as central to all this, which is not the way the people need to see it. So it makes it very hard to have a dialogue with folks who are Chinese politicians, for example, or Korean politicians or Japanese politicians, if you're an American or a European, because right from the get-go, you've got two groups that have very, very different views, both of who they are, how important their place is, and the relative importance of their place to the other place they're talking to. And I think this is something that's really a key part of sort of what this class is about, is getting to understand that Chinese aren't just people that have different food and have a different culture. They also have a different worldview that really doesn't have a lot to do with the Western worldview, even today.